Hello and welcome to Lunch and Learn Online. This is TFL librarian Sharon, and thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Our topic today is Microsoft Excel pivot tables, building on our workshop last week that introduced the basics of functions and formulas. If you're interested in learning the basics of Excel, please check out our previous videos, and please do take a look at our YouTube channel as we have recordings of all our previous workshops on a range of tech topics. Now, just before we dive into pivot tables, I wanted to quickly talk about why we offer classes on baseline skills such as word processing and spreadsheet programs. The short answer is that these skills are considered to be the baseline for what's known as middle skill jobs. In other words, jobs that pay a living wage but typically require less than a bachelor's degree. A study by Burning Glass Technologies, in partnership with Capital One, suggests that productivity software such as Excel, Word, Google Docs, and the like remain in demand across a range of occupations and in a range of industries. They also create opportunities for future advancement because they give you critical skills to build upon. While we'd like to think that these skills are being taught in schools, an Economist Intelligence Unit report suggests that only 44% of 18 to 25-year-olds believe their education gives them the skills they need to enter today's workforce. That's where classes like these come in. Okay, thank you for bearing with me. I just get so excited when I get the opportunity to talk about digital literacy. But you've been patient, and we will now move on to Excel. As I've mentioned in our previous sessions, the look and functionality of Excel does vary between editions, so if you have something other than the 2016 edition of Microsoft Excel, it may look a little different than what's on my screen. For today's workshop, we're going to be concentrating on one specific Excel tool, pivot tables. Pivot tables allow us to quickly and easily make comparisons and spot patterns and trends in our data. In order to practice making pivot tables, we're going to have some data to start with. You'll want to make a table with no empty rows or columns and with just a single row heading for the pivot table to work best. Here on my screen is the example data that I've prepared in advance. I've grabbed a report of some library books, complete with barcodes, call numbers, titles, authors, publication dates, and the number of times the book was checked out. Now, this data set is pretty extensive. I actually have, I believe it's 1,285 rows here. So this is not something we'd want to analyze by hand. It would be really, really time consuming. So now that we have our data set ready, let's start creating a pivot table. Our first step is going to be to go to the Insert tab above the ribbon and click on Pivot Table. As a side note, you'd also want to use the Insert tab if you wanted to say insert a graph or chart instead. Next, Excel is going to ask us what cells we want to analyze. So we could type in a range here of all the cells within my table. You'll notice that Excel has already taken a guess. And if I scroll all the way down to the bottom of my table, I told you it was a long way down. You'll notice that there's this dotted line on the perimeter of my data set. So Excel has correctly identified the start and end of my data. Once we've selected our table or range, we're going to have to decide where we want the pivot table to go. We could place it in a new worksheet or in an existing worksheet. I'm going to select new worksheet because worksheets are like pages in a notebook. I want it to stay all within the same file, so I'm just going to add it on a new page of my existing workbook. And then when we're ready, we're going to click OK. So this is anticlimactic. We're on a new worksheet, and you'll notice that all my previous data is still safe and cozy here on sheet 1. But here on sheet 2, there's not a lot to see. Pivot tables require a little building, so we're going to need to do that now. To add a field to our pivot tables, we'll need to check the field name checkbox over here in the Pivot Table Fields pane on the right side of our screen. As a bit of background information to help us understand how Excel thinks, it's helpful to keep in mind that Excel is going to try to sort your data into some default areas. Non-numeric fields are going to be added to this rows category here. Dates and times are going to be automatically sent to the columns area, and numeric fields are going to automatically be directed to values. Now, that's a nice idea in theory, but in practice, it's going to get us some odd results. For example, if I check the box up here next to barcodes, you'll notice that by default, Excel is going to try to add together the sum of all the barcodes together, this incredibly large number here. That's not really helpful, and it's not something we'd ever want to do. It's just how Excel thinks by default. But just because something is the default doesn't mean we're stuck with it. To change my table around, all I need to do is to drag the fields between the different area boxes. For example, I could drag barcodes here over to rows, to columns, or to filters. If I want to remove barcode entirely as a field, I can click on this little triangle next to the word barcode and click Remove Field. This gives me a lot of flexibility to play around with my data. Let's try a couple examples. If I were to put both the title field and this publication date field into this same area here, the rows area, you'll see that it's allowing me to spot which books were published in the same year. For example, I can see that all these books were published in 1998. If I were to then add the number of times the books were checked out into the values area, it's going to show me not only how many times each title was borrowed, but the sum total of borrows for books published in that particular year. Now I'm going to change things around a little bit. I'm going to remove the title field, and I'm going to add author in its place. By swapping titles for authors in that row area, it's going to let me see that, for example, not only was 2003 here a great year for borrowing these titles, it's also going to show me that books by Nora Roberts here were the most popular. If I were to add title information back into my pivot table, again, all I'm doing is checking and unchecking boxes. Well, doing so would show me that of all the books published by Nora Roberts in 2003, her title, Storm Warning, was the most popular that year. As you can see, the strength of the pivot table is its flexibility. It's easy and it's quick for me to change how my table looks and what results it shows me. How you build your pivot table is really going to depend on what questions you're trying to answer about your data. Personally, I like to really clarify what it is I want to know in advance so that I can set up my pivot table correctly. Of course, there's nothing wrong with playing around with it. So now that we've set up our initial pivot table, we may be coming up against a new problem. Namely that visually, this is still an awful lot of information. We went from 1,285 rows, and the pivot tables actually only increased that because now we've added all this information. I'm up to row 2,394 at this point. That's a lot to look at. Now, we do have ways around this, and we're going to take a look at ways to narrow down our pivot tables. If we look at the tabs above the ribbon once again, you'll notice that we actually have two new tabs that weren't there before: Pivot Table Analyze and Design. We're going to click on the Pivot Table Analyze tab to start with, and then on the option that is, in my opinion, rather threateningly labeled Slicers. I'm not sure why they gave this handy little feature such an aggressive name, but oh well. In short, a slicer is a tool we can use to filter out data from our pivot table. For example, let's use that number of uses again as a slicer. So I'm going to select number of uses, and then I'm going to click OK. Now you'll see we get this strange little pop-up window here that, at least for me, always manages to come on top of my pivot table and actually block out my data. Fortunately, if I hold my left mouse button down, I can drag it off to the side here. Now, in this specific case, this slicer is going to allow me to filter my data simply by selecting a number of uses to limit my data to. Let's try 2. So I only want to see titles that were borrowed twice. As you can see, my pivot table has shrunk substantially to show only the books that were checked out twice and the years in which they were published. If this slicer isn't giving me the information I want, I can click on the Clear Filter button here on the right-hand side. To the left of that button is the Multi-Select button, which would allow me to add extra criteria. Say I only want to see books that were checked out 2 times or books that were checked out 4 times. Clearing the filter is going to return all of my data, safe and unharmed. If I want to get rid of this slicer entirely, I could simply click on it and then press the delete button on my keyboard. Or if I wanted, I could have additional slicers open at the same time. All right, let's go look for that design tab now. You'll notice that if I have the slicer selected, that tab is actually not available. I actually have to select one of the cells within my pivot table to get those tabs back. Clicking on a blank cell will not do it. Clicking on the slicer will not do it. It actually has to be a cell within the pivot table. So I'm going to click on Design this time. Here you'll notice we have some aesthetic options for making our pivot table more visually appealing. Right now it's pretty basic, but I could change colors if I wanted. You'll also notice that we have options for changing the layout of our pivot table. For example, if I click on this Report Layout button, you'll see that this default layout is known as the compact form, but I could also ask to see my data in the outline form. So it's much larger now with each field having its own column essentially. Or I can show it in a tabular form with all the lines between my cells showing. All of these options are valid ways of presenting information. You'll just have to decide what makes the most sense to you and your intended audience. Okay, that's almost our time for today. Just before I let you go though, I wanted to highlight a couple of additional places where you can find more information about Excel. We've only gone over a few basics of pivot tables today, but if this interests you, you may also want to check out the Microsoft Support website and the free courses available with your library card through Universal Class. All right, to recap, we learned how to set up our data in order to create a pivot table, how to build a pivot table, and how to use slicers to filter the information down into something more manageable. Then we looked at ways to make the design more visually appealing and how to present our tables in different ways. Thank you very much for talking about Excel with me for the past few weeks, and I hope you got something out of these workshops. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have a fantastic day.